Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. In our last class, we talked about some of the exciting parts of the early days of the Progressive Era. It's also time that we talk about some of the harder issues. And today we're going to approach the issue of segregation in Episode 2, Jim Crow's Discrimination. So, dear students, incline your ear and hear our stories that you might find your place among his delights. We have three objectives today. By the end of this period, you should be able to, number 5, identify the conditions of Jim Crow-era legalized segregation. Number 6, summarize the approaches of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois on civil rights reform. And 7, characterize discrimination against minorities in the American West. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 5. The term Jim Crow refers to a set of laws that intentionally discriminated against African Americans. The discrimination was most visible in the southern states, but most of the country had some level of legalized discrimination. The term Jim Crow comes to us from an old minstrel song. A minstrel song was like a play that was put on, usually the pretty heavily demeaning to African Americans, and there was one that had a song called Jump Jim Crow, and Jim Crow carries on in the legacy of this in the name. The 15th Amendment of the Constitution prohibited states from having racial restrictions on voting, but there were other restrictions that were allowed. For example, women didn't have the right to a federal vote, and neither did 18-year-olds in this era. In the 1700s and 1800s, a lot of states used that loophole to go enact laws that complied, strictly speaking, with the 15th Amendment, but still had the effect of prohibiting African Americans from the ballot. Some states required a poll tax. A poll tax was where people had to go pay a fee before they were allowed to vote. Poll taxes discriminated against poor white people, but black Americans were especially poor and had the hardest time paying. You also found the rise of something called a literacy test. Literacy tests were used to discriminate against potential black voters. Sometimes the tests were pretty straightforward tests, or sometimes they were obscure sections of Shakespeare plays, or sometimes they were more like brain teasers than literacy tests. In some places, white people got different tests than black people did, and sometimes a person could be exempted from a test altogether if they could prove some level of education, which usually meant that white people were more likely to be exempt than black people. Other restrictions included things like a grandfather clause. A grandfather clause comes about when a person could vote if that person, if their father or if their grandfather could have voted before 1867. Because before 1867, African Americans were unable to vote, so it excluded them and protected white voters. And if they were grandfathered in, they didn't have to go pay a poll tax, or didn't have to go pay for, take the literacy test. And that term, grandfathered in, like to be a grandfather clause or grandfathered in, really betrays its own racial background. Racial segregation laws separated races into private and public places. There was Jim Crow laws meant that black people had to live basically in a parallel society between white people, and the two races would never intersect. Subpoint B. Louisiana state law required that railroads operating in the states provide separate but equal accommodations for both white passengers and black passengers. They prohibited passengers from entering the cars to assign to the other race. So a black person couldn't go into a white car, and a white person wouldn't go into a black car. A group of mixed-race Creole professionals in New Orleans decided to go challenge this Louisiana law, and they formed a citizens group to go mount that legal challenge to go do so. And here we introduce a new person to us known as Homer Plessy. Homer Plessy is actually a mixed-race man. He was 1/8 African American and 7/8 white. But according to the racial codes at the time, he was considered black because he had, like a single drop of black blood. So he was considered black and wasn't allowed to ride in the white train car. However, he purchased his ticket deliberately intending to go violate that law. The railroad had been informed of the challenge, and they sent a private investigator to go to go confront Plessy and go throw him off the train. When Homer Plessy refused to go comply, he was arrested and he was charged with violating Louisiana's Separate Car Act. The case made it all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, who ruled that segregation was legal. It was totally acceptable in public places, and that it didn't violate the 14th Amendment of the Constitution if the separate but equal accommodations were provided to both races. What's known as the Plessy versus Ferguson case is considered among the worst decisions in Supreme Court history. The only dissenter on that decision was John Marshall Harlan. And in his dissent, and writing why he's disagreeing with the rest of the Supreme Court justices, he famously wrote that the Constitution was colorblind and that the law should apply to everyone equally. Today, the Plessy decision, like I said, is considered one of the worst examples of Supreme Court history, but it did legalize segregation segregation for at least like 60 years. States reacted to the Plessy decision by passing a flurry of laws mandating racial segregation in more or less every aspect of Southern life. Jim Crow legislation on all public and commercial spaces in the South. It evidenced that racial and class injustices shaped businesses and consumer culture. The point was not so much to keep the races apart, because people, they didn't interact in a whole lot anyway, and when they did, there was usually sort of like this etiquette and code of behavior. But really what we found the Jim Crow laws were just a way of reminding black people that white people held the upper hand. Subpoint C. That racial etiquette were these informal rules that govern black and white relationship. It enforced a second-class status for black people around America. Things like black men had to go remove their hats when white people were around, or yielding the sidewalk to a white pedestrian walking by, or even like shaking hands between races, strictly prohibited in the racial etiquette. African Americans who didn't follow that racial etiquette, they were often punished or even lynched. Lynching is the thing that, it's to capture a person and to kill them. Usually hanging them is lynching. And it looks like it's a court of law, and it's, like somebody has executed this person with racial justice, but it's not justice. It's it's a vigilante mob grabbing a person and killing them. That's what lynching is. And more than 1,400 black people were killed in this vigilante justice between 1882 and 1892. Many black people migrated to the North altogether for better paying jobs and for social equality. There, in the North, they found just new kinds of discrimination. They were forced into segregated neighborhoods. They were rejected by labor unions. And when they got jobs, they were hired last and subject to get fired first. The economic competition between African Americans and working class white people sometimes even became just actual violent. For example, in 1900, there was the New York City race riot where a black man killed a white policeman who was mistreating the black man's wife. And it set off a racial riot in 1900 in New York City. Roman numeral number 6. In an effort to go achieve real civil rights reform, we meet two people that become sort of the the competing visions, I think, of the way that we can look at black civil rights movement of the early 1900s. Between the year of 1890 and 1915, Booker T. Washington was the dominant leader in African American community and of the contemporary black elite. Booker T. Washington was born into slavery, but he became the leading voice of former slaves and their descendants. Booker T. Washington founded the Tuskegee Institute, today known as Tuskegee University, a historically black college he founded in Tuskegee, Alabama. Washington both taught and exemplified the goal of self-help. In his autobiography, Up From Slavery, became a bestseller, and he basically says that, hey, black people can go make it on their own. They can go achieve whatever future they want to set for themselves. Because of the deep poverty in which most Southern African Americans live, Washington concluded that going to college and getting a traditional book learning education, it was such a waste of time for people who lived in such obscure poverty. And former slaves, they'd been denied basic education. And students, tended to agree with Washington that the road to success required knowledge and training, and it was really just beyond the scope of what Washington felt most poor black people could go achieve. So instead, he focused on industrial education. Students, he argued, would be sure to know how to make a living after they'd left the Tuskegee Institute. Tuskegee sent female graduates into teaching jobs and nursing jobs. Men entered the industrial trades or farming with the latest scientific methods. Tuskegee Institute operated really as a trade school, not as a university in the way that we think about that term today. But as lynchings in the South reached a peak in 1895, Booker T. Washington gave an important speech. This speech becomes known as the Atlanta Compromise, which brought him not just local fame, but really national fame. He called for black progress through education and through entrepreneurship. He said, basically, you don't go directly challenge Jim Crow. That's a fight that you're going to lose. But instead, rather than try to worry about disenfranchisement of black people in the South and the right to vote, just get black people good jobs, and they'll go achieve economic equality. And the economic equality will bring political equality and social equality, and work your way up through the lower parts of the rungs first. The agreement that Southern black people would work and submit to political rule, while Southern white people guaranteed that black people would receive basic education and due process of law. That's kind of like the Atlanta Compromise, that basically black people are going to work, they're going to agree that white people run everything, and that white people are going to say that black people, they can receive an education and they can get treated fair in the courts. That's the idea of the Atlanta Compromise. African Americans wouldn't focus their demands on equality, integration, or justice, and Northern whites would go fund black educational charities and go work their way up through the system. Booker T. Washington suggested that black people and white people could work together together for social progress, and he hoped that if African Americans had good paying jobs, the skill would bring economic equality and later social equality. It's my opinion that Booker T. Washington was playing the long game on civil rights, hoping to achieve a future of equality, even if accepting that the now isn't very good. Secretly, he though was also supporting court challenges to segregation and restrictions on voter registration for more immediate change. Implied in Booker T. Washington's rhetoric, and this is important to know, that implied in the rhetoric was the idea that African Americans could earn their equality in society through economic means rather than political agitation. It doesn't assume that black people just get equality because they're human beings entitled to rights. Implied in this is Booker T. Washington's understanding of like, hey, we'll earn equality at the table rather than just having it bestowed upon us. Washington was and continues to be criticized really as an accommodationist, as an accommodationist to white society and white supremacy, of just giving in rather than trying to approach its real challenges, saying that he couldn't do enough to go challenge Jim Crow. As a moderate reformer who wasn't really threatening to white society, though, Washington had broad support among the white community and really great access to national leaders that a lot of black agitators just didn't have because they were far more confrontational. That far more confrontational side is our subpoint B as we introduce W.E.B. Du Bois. He's often considered the opposite of Booker T. Washington. W.E.B. Du Bois believed that Americans' racial problems were far too urgent for Booker T. Washington's slow-moving hopes. Du Bois insisted on full civil rights immediately and increased political representation. He believed that would be brought about by the African-American intellectual elite. Booker T. Washington wasn't interested in making machinists working their way up from the bottom. He says that black people are equally as smart as white people and that with their proper training they can go achieve at the same highest level. And so he wanted to focus on what he referred to as the talented tenth of African Americans, the top 10% of African Americans, and that they would bring the leadership and the needed chances for advanced education and develop the leadership of the African American future. W.E.B. Du Bois grew up in a relatively tolerant and integrated town in Massachusetts. He graduated from the University of Berlin and later the University of Harvard. He became the first African American to earn a doctorate. So he's really working in that, top 10th, and he's pretty comfortable with the elite status. At first, W.E.B. Du Bois supported the idea of the Atlantic Compromise, but later he broke with that movement, finding it insufficient. In 1905, he founded a black civil rights organization called the Niagara Movement. The Niagara Movement would oppose racial segregation and disenfranchisement. Disenfranchisement, that's kind of a political science term. It basically means when somebody's prohibited from voting, they've been disenfranchised. It opposed the accommodationist approach of Booker T. Washington and others. The Niagara Movement broke down in 1908 over political infighting, but in 1909, Du Bois went on to go found a different organization where he co-founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, and there they would work for political change. Du Bois was a prolific author. His collection of essays was known as The Soul of Black Folk, and it's the seminal work in African American literature. He opens The Soul of Black Folk with a central thesis of much of his life's work, where he says the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. He showed that the injustice of the separate but equal doctrine, which had been handed down to people from the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, he says that basically that is the central problem of the 20th century. His 1935 book called Black Reconstruction in America challenged the prevailing orthodoxy that black people were responsible for the failures of the Reconstruction era. While Reconstruction was a failed political experiment after the Civil War, I think today most historians say that it was basically the political infighting of the Republicans and Democrats and the real failure of Democrat leadership in the South, which caused the Reconstruction to fail. At the time, a lot of people said, no, Reconstruction failed because black people blew it. And W.E.B. Du Bois challenges that in 1935. In his role as the editor of the NCAA's journal, The Crisis, he published a lot of influential pieces, and he's definitely the leading intellectual focus of early 20th century black America. Implied in W.E.B. Du Bois's rhetoric was the idea that African Americans had inherent equality rather than earned equality like we found with Booker T. Washington. And the society should recognize that equality right away and not wait for gradual social change. Du Bois believed that capitalism, he says, was basically a primary cause of racism, and he was generally sympathetic to the socialist causes throughout the rest of his life. Socialism would be a growing political movement, and we'll talk more about it in a future class. And he was also an ardent peace activist as well. Roman numeral number 7. Here I want to turn our eyes westward and introduce some discrimination of some categories which don't often make the dominant discourse of this time. And first I want to talk about Mexican Americans. In the late 1800s, more Mexicans were building railroads in the Southwest than any other ethnic groups. They were accustomed to the Southwest hot, dry climates, yet they were forced to work for less money than other ethnic groups as well. Mexicans became a major force in the Southwest agricultural industries also in the era of the National Reclamation Act. The National Reclamation Act was an irrigation program which turned the dry dry desert into productive farmland and introduced all these new agricultural jobs, and Mexican Americans, I don't think we can call them Mexican Americans yet. I think we're really talking about Mexican immigrants in America. And Mexican immigrants really took those jobs pretty quickly and were an important piece of the National Reclamation Act. Some Southwest Mexicans and African Americans were forced into a system known as debt peonage. It was essentially slavery. I mean, it's not slavery specifically, but it's they ended up in debt and had to go work that debt off to their employer, and more or less operated like slaves. In 1911, the Supreme Court declared debt peonage to be an infraction of the Constitution, the 13th Amendment, and had to go overturn them. Subpoint B. I also want to talk about discrimination against Chinese immigrants as well, because white people feared job competition, and they pushed the Chinese into separate areas and separate schools. We approached this subject a little bit in our last unit with things like the Chinese Exclusion Act and later the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan, but there's this real fear that Asian Americans are going to go take American jobs. And opposition to Chinese immigration led to the Chinese Exclusion Act, where basically they just cut off all immigration from China altogether. This uneasy situation, discriminating against Asian Americans, or not really Asian Americans yet, I keep saying that because I'm speaking really fast, but discriminating against Asians and Mexicans and black people, and all of these roll together into the uneasy tensions that is the heart of the progressive era. The progressive era has a lot of things that are really exciting and shiny about it, and baseball and bicycles, but it also is shows a simmering pot of real cultural change. That cultural change is going to bear out in a whole bunch of different ways, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.